Most businesses never scale because the founder is the bottleneck. I learned over 34 years of building a company that generated over $200 million in annual sales that I had to be obsessed with leadership, focus, simplification, and systemization. But what is the definition of scaling? Well, scaling, really, the definition is simple. It's increasing the sales faster than you're increasing the cost, so that obviously you can become more profitable. But it's a lot easier said than done. So the very first thing that is absolutely critical for you, in order for you to be able to scale, I found, is you got to have the leadership ability. And what does that entail? A few things. One, most important part of the leadership is you've got to have the desire to scale, to grow. And I had that. And I'm not sure where I got it. I don't know if it was genetics. Maybe it was social influence of some sorts. It could have been the fact that my parents talked constantly about, building a business and becoming rich, and they never did that. So maybe I had something to prove. But this is what I know, is that as a leader, founder of your company, owner of your company, you've got to have the desire to scale and do whatever it takes to create the incentive for yourself to do that. The other thing that I think is critical is I had the ability to take on some risk. And I think taking on some risk in the form of borrowing, leveraging, getting debt, I think that's important, because you're going to find as you're building this company that there are things that work. You're going to put in some systems, you're going to create some things, you're going to hit some veins of gold that are really working in your company. And if you pour some debt onto that, pour some money, invest into that, then that's going to turbocharge your ability to scale the company. And it's kind of like, if you can borrow at 5%, but you can make 15 or 20% on that money, why wouldn't you do that? Especially if you know it's going to work. And so that's basically what I did at the company that I started and I ended up selling. I was literally in debt the entire 34 years of my company's existence, because there was always money that I could borrow. And as I got more successful, I could borrow more, but I could borrow the money and make more money on that money that I used, because I was putting it in to things that were working at the company. Now, the third thing that's absolutely critical in your leadership is you've got to be able to delegate. You've got to be able to multiply yourself. Now, I started just myself out of a garage. And I'm sure a lot of you are like me. You're like, there's no way in hell that if I hire somebody that they're going to do as good as me. And that's what I thought, because I knew that company backwards and forwards when I started it. And sure enough, when I hired these people, they weren't better than me. But here's what happens. They get better than you because they're focused on what they're doing. And they start learning things at the company. They learn things that, every week or every day that come up that are teaching them. They're able to, over time, apply their education, maybe previous experience at previous companies, to get better. And the facts are that I just proved that jack of all trades, master of none little saying, I proved it out, because my employees, because they were experts and not jack of all trades, they got better and better. And that made us more profitable and allowed us to scale easier. So the next thing that you've got to do after leadership, and I think this is the most important thing, you've got to create a focus for the company, and that's what I did. And the reason why you've got to create a focus is I did a lot of research, and I learned a lot working at previous companies before I started my company. And I learned that a company that was more focused, that just like we were talking earlier about jack of all trades, master of none. If a company could be more focused and become an expert, then they could get better and better and better than a company that was not as focused. And what did I do at my company? What was the focus that I created at my company? Well, to pick a focus, you analyze the competition. You find a weakness that you can be different from all the competitors. And what I did at my company was I was in the sign supply industry. That's where I had my experience. And I analyzed all the competition within the sign supply industry. And I found a weakness. I found that I could focus on vinyl-oriented supplies instead of all the other supplies. And when I say supply, sign supplies, I'm talking about supplies that you sell to sign companies to be able to make signs, or vehicle graphics and advertising and that sort of thing. And so I decided to focus on the vinyl-oriented sign supplies. It happened to be the fastest growing part of the industry. And I truly did become, our company truly did become the expert. We became better. We got better inventory. Our employees got better. Our systems got better. Our pricing was better. Everything got better than the competition because we were focused. So that's the framework that really begins your ability to scale that company. So once you've set a focus for that company, I learned that you really need to have a mindset, a thinking to constantly simplify the company. So why? I mean, it's kind of common sense. Is it easier to simplify, a two-step process versus a five-step process? No doubt, easier to duplicate and scale a two-step process. But here's the issue. Sometimes you can simplify something to where it's not generating any sales. You can simplify it too much. So what I did is, once I picked the focus for the company and I analyzed the competition, I had a kind of an idea of what I was going to have to offer in the form of products and services, a portfolio, if you will, a collection of things that you start off with that you think is going to allow your company to win over all the competitors, and of course scale, right? Faster than everybody else. And at my company, we started off with, a set of products and services. But I knew that if I could simplify that company and be simpler than the competition, that I should be able to scale a lot faster. So I always had that frame of mind, right? And so after I started the company, we would analyze what was happening at the company constantly, constant analyzation. And sometimes you're going to want to add a service or a product, and sometimes you're going to want to take away a service or product. But once again, I learned that it always had to be with a mindset of making it as simple as possible. So I'm going to give you some examples that we did at the company, and we did a lot more than these examples, but this will kind of get your mind thinking and give you an idea of what to do at your company. Get your mind on a thought process of simplification. So one thing that we did was, when we started the company, we started off accepting cash in payment, along with credit cards, and we also had a private credit policy. Certain customers that applied for credit, we'd allow them to have credit with our company. And we noticed over time that there was about 1.5% of our customers that were paying in cash. And the problem with paying in cash was, for our company, was that we had to maintain all of this cash to be able to make change, and also created a theft problem because it encouraged, unfortunately, some of our employees to steal. And then, of course, it also created a potential theft problem from people outside the company that knew that we had all this cash there. So I decided to eliminate the cash. make our company simpler, eliminate accepting cash. And especially since, only 1.5% of our orders and our customers were paying in cash. And so guess what happened? Almost everybody continued to do business with us. And it did work exactly like we were hoping. It improved the profitability. We had a simpler company, less steps that we had to do, less things that we had to do. Another system that we did, a simplification system that we did was at one point in time as we were growing, we had one facility at the beginning of the company. We had one facility where we were selling our products and services nationwide out of one facility. And we were growing, we were doing well, but we knew that the competition had multiple locations. Several of our competitors out there had more than just one location. So before I continued the scaling of just having one location, I thought I needed to experiment with scaling by opening additional locations that were out there closer to the competition and to the customers. And so we decided to test opening a location outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is where we started the company. And so our first location that we decided to test was in Chicago. There's reasons for that, but the bottom line is we thought that was going to be a great test for our first location. And when we started that company, we thought, because we had a simplification framework mindset, and we knew we wanted to potentially duplicate the expansion of the company, the scaling of the company, we thought, hey, can we operate that company, that new location, without having CSRs there physically at that location? Because all of our competition did. They were taking orders right there at their facilities, as well as, shipping the orders, and the customers would come in and pick them up. But we thought, hey, if we could take orders just centrally, we had a 1-800 number, so it was toll free. They could call in, and we wanted to test it. We did it, and it worked. Virtually all of the customers that called in, a lot of them didn't even realize that we didn't have a customer service rep locally. And so it worked. So we knew that we were going to be able to scale our expansion if we got more increased sales. We knew we were going to be able to scale faster and better, more profitably, because we weren't having to, have customer service reps at each facility. And we would have had to probably have at least 2 customer service reps at each facility, but we were able to just have one centralized customer service rep group, CSR group. So the next thing was, of course, proving if we would get an increased amount of sales, and we did. We were able to get an increased amount of sales relative to what we would have had right there in just operating in one facility in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Another thing that we did, another little simplification step that we did, was when we opened that first facility outside of Tulsa, we thought, what if we didn't have any sales efforts, okay? Because we noticed that a lot of our competitors had all kinds of little brochures and information for when people came to the facility, they could maybe talk to somebody about the products and services. And we wanted to make that facility nothing but operations oriented. So we tried not training the operations people on sales. And we also tried to not have any kind of brochures or advertising or marketing at that facility. We wanted those customers to come in, pick up, and leave. And it worked. And I think the main reason it worked is because we found out that a lot of times the main people that were ordering, they weren't going down there and picking up. A big bulk of them were just sending other people to go pick up those products locally. So we learned that we didn't have to train, customer service oriented techniques and skills to those ops employees. And that way they were able to get better and better at pulling orders and faster and quicker and, not complicated. The business wasn't complicated. Of course, that also meant that we were going to be able to scale the company faster. If we proved that facility was working, we'd be able to scale it faster by opening more locations. And of course, later on, as we got more knowledge about opening that facility, we learned that yes, we could do that. But another part of the scaling that was absolutely critical as we were building this company was the systemization of these things that we were experimenting with and doing. Systemization became a very important part of scaling, because when you systemize things and create standard operating procedures, SOPs, you create a system. It takes the thinking out. It makes duplication easier, because the more things that are different, especially if you're wanting to open more facilities, the more different that they are, it's difficult to duplicate that. So we learned that if we could systemize things, it was a way for us to make it more duplicatable, more scalable. So here's some of the things that we did. We experimented with different sizes of facilities. We tried, 3,000 or 4,000 square feet, and then we tried 10,000 square feet. But what we settled on was 5,000 square feet. And we made that a system. And it wasn't that it was necessarily perfect. In some geographic locations, maybe a little larger would have been more profitable, or maybe a little less would have been more profitable. But we learned that by having a system, by making it systemized, that it was easier for us to compare and scale that company. We could compare results, easier for us to budget, easier for us to finance, easier for us to create standard operating procedures, easier for us to train employees. By systemizing, almost like what the franchise companies have realized. They realized, many decades ago, that if you can simplify, it's easier to train people to operate a franchise. But we found the exact same thing with our employees, as well as with our overall operating of the company. And another thing that we learned about standardizing that 5,000 square feet is we were able to standardize our inventory. And part of the reason that we were opening facilities was we wanted to see if by opening a facility, instead of having to increase the size of our original facility in Tulsa, which would have been difficult because unless we would have had a landlord, or if we would have bought a facility, it allowed us to expand, and expansion was slower by building it or having to go get additional building size. If we could expand by opening facilities around the country, then that would be a way for us to expand our inventory. But by systemizing it and compartmentalizing it, it allowed us to budget easier for future growth. So that systemization became a very integral part of our ability to scale. Another system that we created was we settled on 2 operations employees. And we tried different amounts, but we realized that 2 operations employees could generate within 5,000 square feet the amount of sales that we needed to be able to make a profit. And we also settled on 1 outside salesperson per facility, and that 1 outside salesperson was not handling customer service orders, CSRs type stuff. That was handled all centrally. But that outside salesperson would go out and attack each individual customer and customize by customer, would help us customize the pricing for that particular customer. Larger customers would tend to get better pricing than smaller customers. And sometimes we might even have to create a little bit of more specialized inventory per facility for certain customers. But we found that worked better by having just 1 outside salesperson. So that was a system that we created. And, there was other systems, but I think you get the idea. Systemization is about being able to duplicate and scale faster by creating SOPs and kind of stopping the thinking. Thinking's all put down into a system. And I got to tell you, it worked really well for our company. In 1987, we were approximately $1 million, maybe a little over $1 million in annual sales. We had approximately 10 employees. And by 2020, which was a year before I sold the company, we were up to $200 million in sales, over $200 million in sales with approximately 300 employees. So that was an increase of about 200 times, while the employee base only increased about 30 times. And that's the essence, the definition of scaling: increasing sales and not increasing cost at the same rate. And we were able to do that effectively at the company. And we also had 75 locations. So we started off with one location. We had 75 locations by the time we sold. And by the time we sold, I think if we wouldn't have been able to scale that company and show the proof of scaling, we wouldn't have been able to sell it for over $100 million, which is what we did.